This program is funded in part by a grant from the Champlain Valley National Heritage Partnership under their Making of Nations theme. This webinar and our grant from the Champlain Valley National Heritage Partnership is the kickoff of a series of programs we're doing this year, thanks to the grant from the Champlain Valley National Heritage Partnership. And it will include tours of Valcour Island and some other tours that focus on the military history of the Champlain Valley. Chris has been with the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum since 1998 and full-time there since 1999. He became executive director in November of 2023, following time at the museum as an archaeological diver, conservation lab director, and the director of research and archaeology. He has a bachelor's in history and anthropology from Ball State and a master's in nautical archaeology from Texas A&M. And more than 25 years of experience leading the archaeological examination of underwater sites related to the military and commercial history of the northeastern US and Canada.
Thank you very much, Erin. I appreciate the invitation to be here and looking forward to sharing with the whole audience here a lot of information about the underwater archaeology work that we've done centered around the American Revolution over the past decades, and what we have, give you at least a glimpse of what we have coming up in the next few years. I always like to start with a little bit of background and geography here. Of course, we're talking about the conflict that took place in the 1776 timeframe on Lake Champlain. And, why did this conflict take place in this location? Mainly because Lake Champlain, with the, its 122-mile length, stretching north-south across the Canadian border, empties out through the Richelieu River into the St. Lawrence, and at its southern end reaches almost to the headwaters of the Hudson River. So this entire corridor is basically formed in a mostly all-water route through what was then virtual wilderness. And it was control of this route and its ability to carry large amounts of men and material that made it absolutely essential to control for military purposes. In the French and Indian War, we certainly saw its use as an invasion route into Canada. And once again, that was the case in 1775 at the beginning of the American Revolution, when the American forces invaded Canada in the fall of 1775. And it was just the opposite in 1776 and 1777, when the British used this as an invasion corridor into the colonies. So control of this lake has always been important militarily, and later in the lake's history as a commercial corridor, it was also enormously important. After the failed invasion of Canada in 1775 and the early days of 1776, the American Army was forced to retreat up Lake Champlain, pausing briefly at Fort St. Jean at the northern end of the lake, and then proceeding south to Fort Ticonderoga and ultimately to Skeensboro, which is present-day Whitehall, New York, at the extreme southern end of the lake. And it was at this location in Skeensboro that forces led by Brigadier General Benedict Arnold set up their shipyard and started to build a fleet out of the wilderness. It was fully understood that Lake Champlain would become an invasion corridor, and so there was a decision made to resist that usage of the lake as much as possible by forming a fleet as quickly as possible to defend the lake from the coming invasion from the British. Skeensboro was a perfect place to do this, as there were already established sawmills, ironworks, and some of the infrastructure needed to set up a shipyard in that location. Now, the American fleet at this time, by 1776, consisted of just a few small sailing vessels, like the one in the center of this slide, the Royal Savage, which were captured from the British during that initial foray into Canada and the capture of Fort St. John in 1775. But realizing that those few small sailing vessels were not going to be sufficient to defend the lake, Arnold and his ship carpenters set about building additional vessels to add to the fleet. And these took two principal forms. On the left here in this slide, we have the gunboats. These are 54-foot long boats, about 15 feet wide, They carried 3 cannon. And in total, the Americans were able to produce 8 of these gunboats before they met in battle with the British fleet. They were set up with a single mast with square sails on them, but they were principally a rowed vessel. This is really a terrible sailing vessel, to be brutally honest about it. It's flat bottomed, so unless the wind was directly from the back, from the stern, then the vessel would tend to go sideways instead of forward. So they were really not great sailing vessels, but they were very maneuverable under oars. And due to that flat bottom construction, they were able to access very, very shallow water coves and bays, of which there are many on Lake Champlain, of course. But realizing that these were perhaps not the most effective fighting vessels, the Americans also set about building the vessels type that's shown on the right of this slide, which were known as row galleys. These are considerably larger vessels. They're about 70 feet long and about 22 feet wide, and they carried between 10 and 12 cannon, arranged in a more traditional broadside arrangement like you would see in ocean fighting men of war vessels. As you can see, these were outfitted not with square sails, but with large triangular sails on 2 masts. This is known as a lateen rig, and it was a very common sailing rig in the Mediterranean. And it's quite a unique sailing rig for Lake Champlain. I think this is about the only example I can think of lateen rigged sailing vessels on Lake Champlain. But it was certainly a more effective sailing rig than the square sails found on the gunboats. These were large, pretty unwieldy sails, but still provided much better performance than the square sails on the gunboats. And in total, by the late summer, the Americans had assembled a fleet of 15 vessels. So there was 8 of the gunboats, 3 of the larger row galleys, and then a number of these smaller sailing vessels that had been captured previously that were converted to wartime use. One of which, the Royal Savage, was the flagship of the American fleet until the row galley Congress was completed and added to the fleet. Another of these small sailing vessels, the Enterprise, was used as the hospital ship for the American fleet. And another small sailing vessel that was captured in Skenesboro called the Liberty was used as a transport and a supply vessel. At the same time, the Americans were building their fleet down in Skenesboro. The British were doing the same up at the northern end of the lake at Fort St. Jean. They built a whole series of gunboats themselves, though they used a smaller, approximately 35 foot length gunboat design. They did have masts, but they rarely sailed. They were almost exclusively oar powered, and they carried just a single gun that pointed right out the bow of the vessel. And there was between 20 and 24 of these smaller gunboats on the British side. But they also had a number of larger vessels. They actually took some of the vessels from the St. Lawrence fleet, disassembled them, brought them up the rapids of the Richelieu, and then reassembled them at Fort St. Jean. And that included the Inflexible, which is the vessel that's pictured here on the right, which is the largest warship to fight on, to be on Lake Champlain until the War of 1812. A very substantial and significant vessel for this time period on a lake like Lake Champlain. These 2 fleets finally met in combat at the Battle of Valcour Bay on October 11th of 1776. And this is a really interesting choice of location for this battle on the part of Benedict Arnold. The American fleet had sailed from Ticonderoga, where it was outfitted with cannons and sailing rigs, in July. And they had spent about 6 weeks kind of patrolling the lake, exploring. They took a lot of depth soundings and explored a lot of coves and areas of the lake so that they had a good understanding of what they were working with. And they chose this location between Valcour Island and the New York shore to position their fleet, when they were pretty confident that the British were going to be coming down from Fort St. John in the near future. If you're not familiar with Valcour Island, it's located just a couple miles south of Plattsburgh. and it stands about a mile off of the New York shore. And the real advantage that this gave to the American fleet was that they could anchor in position behind this island, and they didn't become apparent to the British fleet until they had sailed, coming from the north, until they had sailed south past the island, and then they were able to see the American fleet to the north of them between the island and the shore, and they were forced to try to sail up into the wind to come to grips with the American fleet. And this proved extremely difficult for some of the larger vessels of the British fleet, like the Inflexible, the giant Radeau Thunderer was another of these boats that had a hard time. But some of the smaller, better sailing schooners, like the Carleton and the Maria, were able to come to grips with the American fleet, as were their oar-powered gunboats. This led to a gun battle that started around 11 o'clock in the morning and lasted until nightfall, with both sides, giving and receiving a considerable amount of damage. We have reports that by the time night fell, about between 50 and 60 Americans had been killed, and twice that many wounded. And the American fleet found itself very short on ammunition, and pretty much trapped now in this location between the island and the New York shore. As night fell, one of the gunboats, the Philadelphia, which had been hit with a 24-pound cannonball right in its very bow, did sink, and luckily the crew was able to escape from that vessel onto the larger rogue galley Washington, which can be seen in this image on the lower right, with the larger Washington in the background there. Though you will notice that it has only one of those large triangular sails in this image, and that's due to the fact that its foremast had been completely shot away. You can actually see the stub of the foremast here. And I believe that's supposed to be represented in this painting by this mast debris that's floating in the water here. Both of these vessels will come back into our story in a little bit. So keep your mind on the Philadelphia and the rogue galley Washington as we move forward. Now, the American situation was pretty desperate. The British fell back and established a blockading line from the southern end of Valcour Island over to the New York shore, with the idea that they were going to keep the Americans trapped in there overnight and that they would move in and finish them off in the morning. But quite remarkably, the American fleet decided to take a very daring escape route, and they lined themselves up single file. They placed a small light in the stern of each vessel that was shielded on three sides, so it could only be seen from directly astern. And in this single file line, they snuck along the New York shore through the British blockade and fled south. This was a pretty amazing escape from this trap that they had put themselves in, but they managed to pull it off. And one of the things that may have aided them in this escape was the burning of the schooner Royal Savage. Early in the battle, the Royal Savage had been damaged pretty heavily, and due to some poor management, so to speak, by the captain. The vessel had run up on the rocks at the very southern end of Valcour Island itself, and had to be abandoned. And the British, as evening fell, were afraid that Americans would try to come off of the island and take control of the Royal Savage, so they set it on fire to deny its use to the American fleet. And I'm sure this proved to be a really remarkable distraction for all of the Royal Navy sailors who were supposedly on blockade duty, trying to make sure that the Americans didn't escape. This huge conflagration at the southern end of the island was probably a very attractive to the eye, instead of staring out into the murky blackness of the evening. Also, I'd like to keep in mind that most of these sailors were probably at this point pretty much functionally deaf. After listening to cannons in close proximity firing for the better part of 6 or 7 hours over the course of the day, I'm sure they all had very terrible hearing, and I would guess that probably contributed to the escape of the American fleet as well. After departing from Valcour Island, the Americans fled a few miles south to down near Schuyler Island. And here they stopped in the middle of the night to patch holes, to transfer some men between vessels, and to really try to pull themselves together to continue their flight south. And it was at this point that they determined that they actually had to abandon 2 of the gunboats that were too badly damaged to continue. One of these was the gunboat Jersey, and the other was the gunboat Spitfire. They attempted to sink both of these vessels. The Spitfire did sink into deep water, and again, we'll come back into our story here in a little while. The Jersey, on the other hand, was apparently swamped, and when the British set off in pursuit of the Americans the following morning, they came upon the Jersey full of water, but not entirely sunk, and they were able to recover that vessel and incorporate it into their fleet. On the morning of the 12th, the Americans continued their flight south, kind of against the wind. So I think there was probably a lot of rowing going on and very little actual sailing. The British, realizing that the Americans had escaped, but still being able to see their sails off on the far southern horizon, did set off in pursuit of the American fleet. But they were several miles behind. They weren't able to close up with the Americans because of the contrary wind, but they continued to follow them up the lake through the day on the 12th and into the evening and early morning of the 13th. It wasn't until mid-morning on the 13th when the winds changed to out of the north, and that actually allowed the British fleet to close in on the American fleet quite rapidly on the morning of the 13th, and a running gun battle ensued. Almost immediately, the row galley Washington was captured, was forced to strike its colors due to the fact that one of its masts had been shot away, as we previously discussed, and it had been so badly damaged by the fighting on the 11th that the captain of the vessel was afraid to even fire his own guns to defend his vessel because he was afraid it would shake the whole boat apart. So he was forced to strike his colors. They were lingering behind the other remains of the American fleet, and so they were captured. Now, the Philadelphia crew that had escaped onto the Washington was not keen on being captured by the British. They all, or a good portion of them, apparently jumped into a bateau that the Washington had been towing, and they escaped to the New York shore and ultimately made their way overland back to Fort Ticonderoga. But now the remains of the British fleet, or the rest of the British fleet, caught up with the remains of the American fleet and really started to pummel them pretty viciously from between Split Rock Mountain and Ferris's Bay, which is this red portion of the line here on my map. This was about a 2-hour running gun battle. And here we see the real significant difference between both the British vessels versus the severely battered and poorly manned American fleet. This was, while the battle at Valcour Bay itself wasn't horribly one-sided, this absolutely was. The British were really just having their way with the American fleet, pulling up alongside them and pouring whole broadsides into these poor vessels as they tried to make their way south. Realizing that he was going to lose the rest of his fleet, Arnold made the very dramatic decision to drive 4 of the remaining gunboats and his new flagship, the row galley Congress, into a small bay on the Vermont side of the lake that was then known as Ferris's Bay. And here, in an effort to deny the capture of the fleet to the Americans, he ran his boats ashore. They were lit on fire, and they left their flags flying while all of the men jumped overboard and carried what personal items and armaments they could onto shore. And they set up a defensive position at the top of a bluff at the back of Ferris's Bay. And here they defended their vessels until they were so obviously engulfed in fire that they couldn't be rescued, couldn't be saved by the British forces, who were outside of the harbor, tacking back and forth and firing at the Americans as they attempted to escape into the Ferris's farm fields. Now, this is yet another really clever position for Arnold to pick. Arnold, or Ferris's Bay, as it was known at the time, is an extremely shallow water bay. Even at the mouth of the bay, it's only about 15 feet deep. And therefore, the larger British vessels were too deeply drafted to actually enter the bay itself. So they couldn't follow the Americans in and try to capture those vessels before they were completely burned. And they opted to just stand outside of the bay, tack back and forth across the mouth of the bay, and shoot at the Americans as they attempted to escape. Once their fleet was fully engaged and nearly destroyed, the Americans they gathered their forces near the Ferris's homestead, which this bay was named after the homesteading family that lived on its shores, the Peter Ferris family, who were well-known rebel sympathizers, and they opted to flee south with the escaping American crews when they left and headed towards Crown Point and Fort Ticonderoga. So that's kind of the background history to the archaeology that we're going to talk about. And I want you to keep in mind the three main components of this 3-day battle, right? We have the battle at Valcour Bay itself. We have the escape and the running gun battle as the American fleet fled south and the British pursued them. And then we have this action at Ferris's Bay, which was later renamed Arnold's Bay for the very obvious historic event that happened there. And that's probably the way I'll refer to it from here on out, because I always get those two confused when I'm speaking about them historically. It was known as Ferris's Bay, but it was renamed Arnold's Bay shortly thereafter. All right, so if we talk about the archaeology or the recovery of archaeological materials from the first part of our story here, the Battle of Valcour Bay, that started as far back as the 1930s. I want to bring your attention again to the Royal Savage and the fact that it was run up onto the southern end of the island and was burned ultimately. This is a vessel that never really completely went out of public knowledge. We have newspaper accounts throughout the 19th century and the early 20th century of people visiting the site and removing timbers and occasionally artifacts from the site. It sat in relatively shallow water, I think less than 20 feet, excuse me, and was probably visible during low water events from the water surface. So it was something that was picked over quite well up into the early 20th century. In the 1930s, a gentleman named Lorenzo Hagland, who was a commercial salvage diver, as the guy that made his living going out and recovering sunken vessels. He was vacationing on Lake Champlain with his family, and he came to learn about the history of Lake Champlain and the military vessels that participated in the Revolutionary War there. And he became fascinated by it, and he was determined to go and find some of those vessels. And the first one that he was able to locate was the Royal Savage. And in 1934, he and a crew recovered what was left of the Royal Savage. They used some empty oil drums that they sank down and strapped to the remains of the vessel. And then they pumped air into those 55-gallon drums, which lifted the boat up out of the mud, or the remains of the boat up out of the mud, and they winched it ashore. Here you can see the lower portion of the hull dragged up onto Valcour Island. This is actually Lorenzo Hagland sitting on the timbers and creating a sketch of what was recovered. And then they weren't really sure what to do with it. And they didn't really have a place to store it. So they actually disassembled it. They took it all apart and shipped it back over to Hagland's vacation property in Valcour, in Plattsburgh. And the timbers actually ended up staying there well into the 1990s. Eventually, in a weird twist of fate, those timbers were sold to the city of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which at the time was considering opening a historic museum and wanted these timbers for some reason for their display. Unfortunately, that museum never materialized, and the remains of this vessel and its associated artifact collection were left to rot in a city maintenance shed until the city decided to try to auction off those pieces in 2014 and recuperate some of the money that had been spent to purchase them in the first place. So they started to list this as an auction item in 2014, and interested parties like the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, Fort Ticonderoga, and other organizations around the Champlain Valley reached out to the U.S. Navy and really pressured them to step in and to reclaim these artifacts, which are certainly Navy property. And I think initially the city of Harrisburg was a little resistant to this until the JAG lawyer showed up and explained to them that it would be in their best interests if they would just donate these items to the Navy, and thankfully they did so. These are some images of the more than 1,400 artifacts that came along with the disarticulated ship timbers. And all of that material is now down on the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. at Navy History and Heritage Command, who's doing an amazing job in conserving all these artifacts and in actually carrying out a conservation plan on all the disarticulated timbers from the Royal Savage. And we hope that there was some additional release of information about the design of that vessel and about this artifact collection in the next couple of years, certainly as we approach 2026. After the Royal Savage, Haglund was emboldened to go and look for other vessels that might have been sunk at Valcour Bay. And 1935, he relocated the gunboat Philadelphia and raised it and found it to be virtually intact. All 3 guns were still on board. It still had a full artifact collection. The main mast was standing for a few feet. It had been broken off at some point, but was able to basically pump this boat out with a tarp underneath it to give it a second skin and float it into shore, which is quite remarkable considering it had been under the water for more than 200 years. The boat, Haglund spent the next 25 years of his life trying to find a home for this vessel and never really succeeding. He did load it onto a barge for a while, and it traveled around Lake Champlain and the Hudson River as a floating display of this remarkable artifact. It was displayed in a barn on Willsboro Point for a number of years. And ultimately, upon Haglund's death, it was finally accepted by the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and was shipped down there in 1960, I believe. And it remains on display at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History to this day. And frankly, it is currently undergoing a complete reconservation and reassessment by a team of archaeologists from the Lake Champlain, from Texas A&M University, who are working with the Smithsonian to make sure that this vessel lasts for another 250 years into the future. So it's a really great exhibit if you have the opportunity to go and see it. The more recent archaeological examination of Valcour Bay started in 1999, when this gentleman, pictured on the left here, Ed Skolin, was doing some diving in Lake Champlain. Ed was a New York State police trooper and part of the New York State dive team, state police dive team. And he was in Valcour Bay working with a new metal detector that the force had acquired, and he was getting some experience with that. And he found this muzzle from an exploded cannon. Now, at this point, we had thought that Valcour Bay had been pretty well picked over as far as artifacts, because there were generations of people that, as they learned to scuba dive, they would go to Valcour Island with their instructors, and for their final dive, they would go and try to find a cannonball or some other artifact from the battle to take home with them. So we assumed, it's always dangerous, we assumed that the battlefield had been pretty well picked over. But with Ed finding this cannon muzzle, we came to realize that there probably were still a considerable number of artifacts there still to be found. And that kicked off the Valcour Bay Research Project, which continued from 1999 until 2004, in which we attempted to metal detect very systematically the bottom of Valcour Bay in the area where we believed that the American fleet was located. Using the location of that exploded cannon muzzle as kind of our 0 point, We established this extensive grid network. So that cannon muzzle was found right here in these purple squares. And from that 0 point, we established a whole sequence of 50-foot squares that we then very meticulously metal detected and marked, and in some cases recovered artifacts from those locations. Several hundred artifacts were recovered, including a whole variety of different types of cannon shot. We have all kinds of different sizes of grape shot, canister shot, solid cannonballs. Some oddities like this doorknob shaped thing here up at the top. That is what was known as a bar shot that would have been fired out of a cannon that would kind of spin and tumble as it flew through the air. And it was really effective at cutting the sails and rigging out of enemy vessels. And we even found a number of exploding shells. So these are basically hollow cannonballs that would have had gunpowder filled that cavity inside, and then they had a wooden plug fused in this hole. And these are very unusual to find at a naval battle. Not very many sailing vessels in the 18th century carried howitzers or mortars, which are the type of artillery you would use to fire exploding shells. But we did come to find out that some of the British gunboats were manned by some of the German mercenaries that were in service with the British Army, and they were all howitzer men. So some of those gunboats on the British side were equipped with howitzers and were firing exploding shells at the American fleet, and we found evidence of that. We found both fragments of exploded shells, and we also found some intact shells, which must have hit the water before they had the opportunity to explode. There was also a significant amount of personal armament artifacts that were located: bayonets, a nice belt axe, this cartridge box, which we found the wooden block. This is what a colonial soldier would have carried his ammunition for his musket in. Each of these holes in this wooden block would have carried one paper cartridge that you could use to load your musket. The remains of a small sword were found, as well as all other types of material you can imagine. It was really a pretty spectacular project, and we found a lot of amazing artifacts there. But probably the one that is the most compelling are the parts of the very first artifact that was found there. That exploded cannon that Ed Skolin found in 1999. That's kicked off this whole operation. During the course of surveying all of those various grid squares, we actually found 5 more fragments of this same cannon. And we can now reconstruct the entire gun, all except for maybe one probably foot long and 4-inch wide section. We have the entire gun to reconstruct. This is a 6-pound cannon, which is a relatively small gun for the American fleet. And through some historic research, we were able to determine that only a few of the American gunboats carried 6-pound cannon. And that led us to start to think about the gunboat New York, which was a sister ship to the Philadelphia, one of those 8 gunboats that was built at Skeensboro. And we learned that the crew of the New York was from Westfield, Massachusetts. And we were able to find a pension record in which somebody mentioned that they had been on board the gunboat New York when a cannon exploded, and that it had killed the lieutenant on board the vessel, as well as wounding several other people. So that really tied that exploded cannon to a very specific moment in time during the battle, which is really quite a remarkable thing in archaeology to do that. Additional research led to the discovery of this memorial stone in a graveyard in Massachusetts. And this is the part that really gets to me. This memorial stone says, "This monument is erected to the memory of Lieutenant Thomas Rogers by Miss Molly, his sorrowful widow. He was killed by the splitting of a cannon on Lake Champlain on the 11th day of October, 1776. I mean, this is absolutely insane that we're able to tie this moment, this family, this artifact, this boat, all together with this one artifact. That's a pretty rare thing even in archaeology, and certainly one of the most impactful artifacts that I've ever had the the pleasure to encounter and to be able to study. Moving on from Valcour Bay itself into our second phase of the 3-day Battle of Lake Champlain, we come to the run and gun battle and the escape south. And the real evidence of that lies in the gunboat Spitfire. Right, this is the boat that was abandoned in the night of October 12th or early morning of October 11th and 12th that sank into deep water. This boat was relocated in 1997 during the Lake Champlain Cultural Resources Survey, which was an effort between the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum and the Middlebury Geology Department to map the entire bottom of Lake Champlain using side scan sonar. The Maritime Museum, of course, was interested in the cultural resources that were found during that survey, and Middlebury College was more interested in the geological formations that were documented during that survey. But in June of 1997, as they were surveying, they came across this sonar image in the upper left here, which was very clearly a gunboat, and its location also suggested that it was probably a gunboat. And some divers were sent down to verify the site that year, and they were very excited to find a completely intact gunboat sitting in very deep water on the New York side of Lake Champlain. Mast is still standing. The bow gun is still in place. Its 2 waist guns are missing, but otherwise the vessel is completely intact. Filled pretty much up to the gunnels with sediment on the inside. So undoubtedly there is also an entire artifact collection buried in this vessel as well. Over the course of the next 20 years, the boat was monitored and visited fairly regularly, both with divers and remote operated vehicles, just to monitor its condition and see if it was being impacted by either divers, fishing activities, the environment. We're always concerned about invasive mussel species in Lake Champlain colonizing these shipwrecks. So we were keeping a fairly close eye on it. And we really started into new research on the site back in 2021, when, again, in collaboration with Middlebury College, we conducted a multi-beam sonar survey of the site and its surrounding area. And we also returned in 2022 with some colleagues who are experts at photogrammetry. So this is the collection of a 3-dimensional model with the data to form a 3-dimensional model of a shipwreck site. And as this site is in considerably deep water, we opted to collect that data using a remote operated vehicle. So a little underwater robot on which we mounted 2 GoPro cameras and a bunch of dive lights to give it a bunch of extra illumination. And over the course of 5 days of doing ROV dives on the site, we collected more than 30,000 still images of the wreck site. And we were able to use those to create a really detailed 3-dimensional model of the Spitfire remains. And here's a couple of still images of the Spitfire, and you can see that it is still remarkably intact. The bow gun is still in place. The mast is still upright. We have noticed that the position of the topmast and the trestle trees, this kind of crossed hatch feature here amidships, seems to have been dislodged. It was probably impacted by fishing gear. Specifically, a downrigger ball might have struck it. This is a type of deep water fishing technique that's used in Lake Champlain pretty regularly. So now we're working towards what's next for the Spitfire. We have just recently wrapped up a significant size grant from the American Battlefield Protection Program to plan for the future of the Spitfire site. That involved the development of an advisory council of regional stakeholders and archaeological experts to help us create the research design for future archaeological work on that site. As I mentioned, that was just recently completed, and we've moved into the fundraising phase of our project with an aim towards doing field work on the Spitfire site starting in 2026. Our initial plans are pretty limited in scope, but we want to further characterize the site, collect some wood samples, collect wood and soil samples, do some documentation, measured documentation, as well as some additional detailed photogrammetry studies. We also would like to recover exposed artifacts. There are a number of artifacts that do appear above the mud line, and those we would like to recover for study. And all of this will be the baseline of information that we need to plan for a full excavation of the site, either in 2027 or in the years shortly thereafter. And in this effort, we are partnering with the U.S. Navy History and Heritage Command, who are going to be able to supply some expertise, some technology, and potentially some personnel to help with this project. And we're really looking forward to working with them to move this project forward for 2026. And that brings us to the third part of our discussion of the Battle of Lake Champlain, and that's Arnold's Bay, previously known as Ferris's Bay. This is a really small little harbor on the Vermont shore. It's about 300 yards across, maybe 300 yards from where this picture was taken to the mouth of the bay. And this picture, I should mention, is at the top of the bluff that I mentioned previously. It's about a 30-foot elevation change from the shoreline up to this farm field, which would have been a farm field in 1776 as well. This is where Peter Ferris and his family grew crops and grazed their animals. And quite remarkably, this area around Arnold's Bay has seen very little development in 250 years since this took place. So we're really lucky to be able to have a pretty much untouched site to work with here at Arnold's Bay. We of course had the burning of the vessels there on October 13th of 1776. And much like the Royal Savage, those vessels and the burned remains of those vessels never really fell out completely out of public consciousness. They were in quite shallow water. I'm sure they were visible during low water years. This was still an active harbor. There was a sail ferry that operated out of Arnold's Bay over to Westport, New York, and I'm sure they saw these vessel remains regularly as they were transiting in and out of Arnold's Bay. And that led to, like at the Royal Savage site, a lot of artifact recovery from the sites, a lot of timbers being recovered and repurposed, were used to make canes and gavels and all kinds of interesting things. So in the bay here, there was, again, 4 of the gunboats that were burned and one of the row galleys, the row galley Congress. Over the course of the 19th century, 3 of the gunboats were pulled out of the water. They were either disassembled and pulled out. One of them may have been used as a ferry for a short time by the Ferris family. We don't know what ultimately happened to that one. But those 3 boats have been lost to history. In 1892, the family that operated the sail ferry out of Arnold's Bay, Captain John Adams and his family, attempted to recover the remains of the row galley Congress. They ended up just recovering about 30 feet of the stern of the vessel, which includes the keel, the stern deadwood, and a number of floors. Part of the keelson here, it appears as well. This was displayed on the shore for a while. Ultimately was moved down to behind the hotel that's at Chimney Point and is now the Chimney Point Historic Site. Unfortunately, these remains rotted and were pretty much lost to us. Rather surprisingly, 2 of those floors, 2 of these, what you might refer to as ribs, or these curved timbers that ran across the ship, were saved from the site and were donated to the museum, to the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum in the 1990s, and are now on display in our Revolutionary War display. Also in the 1930s, this small cannon was located by a gentleman who was doing some experimental diving in Arnold's Bay. He was actually using a homemade diving suit So this is a hard hat diving contraption, which he was relying on his wife to pump air down to him from the surface while he stomped around on the bottom. And he managed to survive that. And in the course of those explorations, he found this small cannon from Arnold's Bay as well. In 1952, Lorenzo Hagland, the recoverer of the Royal Savage and the Philadelphia, was still around in the area and still actively looking for shipwrecks to recover. He came to Arnold's Bay with a team, and they recovered the last remaining gunboat remains in 1952. Once again, Hagland used his famous oil drums to refloat the boat, and then they towed it across the lake to near the mouth of Ausable River on the New York shore, where it was resunk for a number of years until they were able to find a place to put it on the shore at the mouth of the Ausable River. This is a location that that Hagland had really hoped would develop into a maritime museum in which he could display this vessel remains as well as some others that he had recovered. Unfortunately, that never materialized. Hagland died in 1960, and this boat was just rotted away, and eventually it was bulldozed, and that is now the site of the KOA campground at the mouth of Ausable Chasm. So unfortunately, another one that was lost to history for us. We do luckily have a number of photographs of the vessel, but they're not particularly great. And we had one researcher in the 1960s who went over there and did a few very basic measurements, but otherwise this was lost to us as well. In the bay itself, we had a group of avocational archaeologists who came to the remains of the Congress. Now, this is the only vessel remains left in Arnold's Bay, and they carried out some excavations in 1960 and 1961. And they recovered quite an assembly of artifacts, which I'm happy to report have also been donated to the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. You can see this included shipbuilding tools like this adze, a cold chisel. This is a part of an iron rod that would have been used to fasten timbers together. We have some exploding shell fragments, referring back to our previous discussion of the British actually firing exploding shells at the American fleet. It certainly appears that some of them were on target, and these shell fragments landed inside the hull of the Congress and were later excavated from it in the 1960s. We have glass and ceramic remains, as well as pieces of armament. This is a musket trigger guard, or part of a musket trigger guard. We have some bayonet scabbard belt hooks and part of a sword pommel, a sword handguard here, as well as many other really interesting and fascinating artifacts, which I'm so happy to have added to our collection because they really round out the studies that I'm going to talk about now. In the 1980s, there was a terrestrial excavation carried out of the Peter Ferris homestead, which was right on the bluff of Arnold's Bay and was found to be actually eroding into the lake. That bluff face was retreating into the farm field, and in that process, this foundation hole of the Ferris homestead was starting to fall into the lake. So Maritime Museum, in collaboration with David Starbuck, a well-known archaeologist of the Hudson and Champlain Valleys, came and did some excavation work at Arnold's Bay and recovered a considerable number of interesting artifacts, including several iron shot that were almost certainly fired at the Ferris homestead during the Americans' escape from their burning fleet on October 13th of 1776. In 2001, the Maritime Museum returned to Arnold's Bay in an effort to relocate the remains of the Royal Galley Congress, or what was left of it. It's really just the forward half of it. And you can see here very clearly, right? This is the Congress. They found this plank sticking out of the mud, which led to them relocating several more bits of timber and frames sticking up out of the mud, and they were determined that this was the remains of the Congress. That was pretty much it for the next 20-ish years. We kept an eye on the site. Otherwise, it remained undisturbed. Now, in 2021, we were awarded an American Battlefield Protection Program grant from the National Park Service to do an examination of the Arnold's Bay battlefield. And that that incorporated both terrestrial examination of the farm fields around Arnold's Bay, as well as in-water work examining the bottom of Arnold's Bay and the Congress remains itself. So in 2021, we got back into the lake and did some exploring. We were able to relocate that plank that was sticking out of the mud, and some other associated timbers that we were able to expose little pieces of, just so we could be certain that we were looking at the remains of the Rogue Alley Congress. Directly adjacent to these timber remains, we also encountered several large piles of rock, which were very unusual for the topography of Arnold's Bay. And these are almost certainly ballast stones that were in the hull of the Congress in 1776, and that were this pile that we're looking at the image of here was probably dumped out of the stern of the boat when it was dragged ashore by the Adamses in 1892. As they pulled the stern off, this pile of rubble would have rolled down and formed this heap that we found on the bottom of the lake. The fall of 2021, we also started the terrestrial examination of the area around Arnold's Bay. For this purpose, we brought in a group called the Advanced Metal Detecting for the Archaeologist group that actually ran a course for interested folks who wanted to learn archaeological practices of metal detecting. So we had a group of about 25 students come and participate in this. We metal detected along the shoreline and in these boxes that are indicated in the map here. Over the course of a long weekend. And we found a considerable number of artifacts, both on the shoreline and in the farm fields. Again, this consisted of quite a few pieces of shot, both lead and iron shot, some buttons, another bayonet scabbard hook, part of a shoe buckle. This is a lead, folded piece of lead that would have fit around the flint from a flintlock musket, as well as a large number of other artifacts, more than 200 artifacts found over the course of just this terrestrial metal detecting portion of the program. Later that year and in 2022, we focused on metal detecting in water, and we established a series of transects. That's these long blue lines here that you see in this aerial photography. The yellow box here indicates where the Congress timbers are located. At this point, we did not have a permit from the U.S. Navy to actually access the Congress remains itself. Those still remain the property of the U.S. Navy, and therefore we have to have a separate permit from them to examine that wreckage. So we focused in 2022 mostly on metal detecting these transects around the Congress site. The goal here was really to, we had hopes of trying to locate the burning and abandonment locations of the other 4 gunboats, and just to get an idea of what the artifacts scatter through this area was. So we used these transects as our guideposts, and we systematically metal detected along the length of those lines, and documented the location of any artifacts that we encountered. And we encountered quite a few. Each of these colored pins indicates an artifact that was found during the metal detecting of these transects. In total now, we have more than 800 artifacts that were recovered from the site. And on this map, I have color coded them. So the light green pins are actually all lead shot. The bright red pins are iron shot. So that's cannonballs, grape shot, and canister shot. The hot pink pins are iron fasteners, so iron nails and spikes. And then there's a variety of other cupreous, copper-based materials that were found. Just a remarkable density of artifacts. And in fact, we were assuming that we would find kind of distinguishable groups of artifacts that might indicate where these other boats were abandoned and burned. And that was not the case. We just found artifacts everywhere. So that's both exciting and a little bit daunting and disconcerting that we weren't able to identify the other vessel burning locations. We have some theories there, but nothing concrete. Again, found lots of iron shot. Here you see a 6-pound cannonball that a volunteer diver is showing, and the base of an inkwell, which almost certainly came out of the Congress and was probably spilled out of the remains of the stern of the vessel that was recovered in 1892. Really cool to find that inkwell. Other things that were found were personal armament. We have the remains of a bayonet here. It's missing its socket, but otherwise well preserved. And then we have very personal items. This is the handle from a pewter spoon, and you can see on the back side of it, a soldier or sailor has actually carved the initials AP into that spoon handle so that they could keep track of their eating utensil. And these are the kind of things that obviously give you a real personal connection to the people that were involved in these historic events. Finally, in the late fall of 2022, we did receive that permit from the U.S. Navy to do some excavation at the Congress site. And we were able to spend just one solid week doing excavation. At this point, what we had seen at the site were just a number of frame tips sticking up. And our expectation was that we would, starting at one frame tip, we would dig down, we would follow the timbers across the center line of the vessel, and then we would come up and encounter the other exposed wooden bits on the opposite side of the vessel. And this turned out not to be the case at all. What we actually excavated was this narrow trench. And you can see there's, this timber was exposed here and these timbers were exposed on this side, but there are no centerline timbers, no keel or keelson evident in the center of this structure, which is what we expected to find. It wasn't until we had dug down a lot more on the north end of this structure that we were able to determine that this is actually the keel. This timber that's labeled number 1 here between these two frames, that's the top of the keel. So this is actually the center of the vessel, and the vessel has broken open, and what we're looking at is just the starboard side of the vessel structure. So this was really fascinating, and this is the area that had been previously examined in the 1960s by those avocational archaeologists. So we didn't actually find too many artifacts in this area, at least not in this 2022 excavation. So we were pretty confident that we were in the same area that previous work had been done. And now we were very intrigued by the fact that we had just half of the remains of the vessel in this structure that we were going to examine further. And there was some indication that off, continuing north from the keel, there are actually some additional planks and that may be a suggestion that the port side may be present here as well. Unfortunately, when the crew in the 1960s excavated the starboard portion, they removed all the ballast stones that they found there and they put them outside of the structure that they were excavating, which means they were actually putting them on top of where the port side of the vessel might be resting. So that's a future problem, or I should say opportunity for us to do some further exploration of the port side of this vessel. We returned in 2023 with some heady plans to do some additional excavation. If you recall, 2023 was an extremely rainy summer once again, and we ended up having a kind of a very broken field season. But we did get several weeks of excavation done at the site in 2023. Using 2 induction dredges, which were powered by these Honda water pumps, we were able to excavate some additional remains on the starboard side of the bow portion of the Roe Galley Congress. As we're dredging, this is kind of like an underwater vacuum cleaner. at the far end of the tube where the sediment that's vacuumed up gets expelled out the end of the spoil tube of this dredge system, we have attached a mesh bag, which is there in case you accidentally suck up an artifact and send it down the tube. It gets caught in this bag. And at the end of each dive, we look through what's collected in that bag to determine if there are any artifacts there. And here you can see my good friend and colleague, Sherilyn Gilligan, sorting through the mess of material that's collected in one of these spoil bags, which is mostly zebra mussel shells, weed fragments, a lot of little sticks and twigs, but occasionally you find little artifacts in there. But it sure seems like Cher's having a good time searching through the spoil bag there. We did find a few really interesting artifacts during this 2023 excavation, some additional lead shot, another cupreous button, random cupreous fragment that we can't identify, and even a nearly intact, beautiful leather shoe, which is really another one of those artifacts that always gives you kind of a personal connection with the people that live through these historic events. One of the really interesting artifacts that we did find was this glass button insert. You can see here it's very stained, but it's a piece of clear glass. It's tiny, smaller than a dime. I'm quite surprised we were able to find it, but this would have been set into a button, probably on a cuff from a very fancy officer's jacket. And here you can see the outline. There is actually an image impressed into this clear glass of a sailing ship, which I just found really remarkable and quite exciting. I'm not aware of other examples of this type of stamped glass cuff button, not ones that display a ship anyway. So this is something we're really interested in doing some additional research on and learning more about, but a really exciting find from the Congress remains. And here is a three-dimensional model of the extent of the excavations from 2023. To orient you, these two timbers here, this was the trench that we excavated in 2022. So this is the keel. You can see it extends quite a bit further forward and towards the stern. We exposed a lot more frame timbers, some internal, what's known as ceiling planking, as well as about 14 hull planks that are preserved in this fragment of the vessel. One of the really interesting things about photogrammetry, in addition to being able to visualize the site, the entire site in a single image, it is also really good at capturing the shape of the structure that you're documenting. So we were able to extract the curvature of the hull of the Rogue Galley Congress from this three-dimensional model. And we took those curves and we were able to compare them to the lines drawing of the Rogue Galley Washington. Remember, the Washington was this vessel that was captured by the British at the beginning of the running gun battle. And when they brought the Washington into their service, they took a nice, they made a nice lines drawing, which was kind of standard practice for the Royal Navy to document any vessels that they captured, so that if that vessel ended up performing exceptionally well, they could reproduce it as needed. So we were able to take the shape information from this lines drawing, compare the curves that we found in the photogrammetry model of the portion of the Congress, the sister ship to the Washington, that we excavated. And that let us know that we were looking at a fairly large fragment of this portion of the starboard bow of this Rogue Galley. So there's still certainly lots more there to be done, both on the starboard side and to explore underneath this ballast pile on where the port side might remain. And we hope to be doing that in the future as time and funding allows. So that kind of wraps up our 2026 or our 2023 excavations and our work at Arnold's Bay, and kind of brings to the end our 3-day battle and the archaeological evidence thereof. But I just real quick would like to point out that, we have the 250th anniversary of all these activities is coming up in 2026. And in addition to the work that we hope to be doing on the Spitfire site at that time, we are also redesigning our Revolutionary War exhibit here at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, where we will be incorporating the results of all of these various excavations over the last 25 years into that new exhibit, and interpreting the Battle of Lake Champlain through those artifacts and through the personal stories that we've uncovered, like the one of the exploding cannon. And so we can share those with the public as we move forward. And that's what I've got for you today. So I'd be happy to move on to taking some questions. I hope I didn't run too overly long in my timing, but I will stop sharing here and we can go to the questions.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was perfect timing and really interesting, informative, and I feel like sets the stage so well for as we're going into the 250th commemoration. I have a few questions here.
Great.
I'm guessing this is the split cannon from the New York. Was it made at a forge in America, or was it a captured British gun?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and its history is even more complicated than that. You can believe it. This gun is actually Swedish in origin, which is totally bizarre. So it's quite probable that this cannon was captured by the French on the continent and then brought over to the New World and put into Fort St. Frederick, which is where Crown Point is located now, and ultimately abandoned there when they left that fortification. And when the Americans in 1776 were desperate for armaments to put onto these vessels, they were scouring the area. Obviously, there was a lot of ordnance at Ticonderoga, some of which had been sent down to Boston to participate in those actions. But they also went to Crown Point and scoured the area, and they probably dug up this old gun, cleaned it up, and put it on this boat. So I'm sure that that probably factored into its ultimate demise and the fact that it burst when it was being fired. It does give you the rare opportunity to see what the interior of one of these guns actually looks like. And when you look at the 4 or 5 inch thick cast iron that was used to make this gun, you can see all kinds of little pockets and odd inclusions. And I think just the wear and tear of it being exposed to the elements for many years and then being repeatedly heated and cooled and fired ultimately just led it to bursting apart, and unfortunately taking Lieutenant Thomas Rogers with it.
I'm going to ask the other cannon question, which is what happened to the small cannon found in Arnold's Bay by the amateur diver who had the homemade suit?
Yeah, that cannon is actually here on display at the Maritime Museum as well. That gentleman, whose name was Paul Billhuber, lived down at the Basin Harbor Club for many years, and he had it displayed in front of his cottage at Basin Harbor for a number of years. And then ultimately, after he passed away, it was donated to the Maritime Museum, and it's in our current Revolutionary War display.
Despite the freshwater location of these ships, what is the most major concern of the water that prevents their preservation? For example, organisms you had mentioned, invasive species.
Yeah, absolutely. Our main concern are the invasive mussel species that have moved into the lake. Of course, we're probably all familiar with zebra mussels, which have been in the lake since the early 90s, and many other surrounding lakes and waterways. And zebra mussels, once they move into a new environment, their population just explodes, and they tend to colonize things in very dense mats. They will actually build on top of each other and completely coat solid structures that stick up out of the mud, and that includes shipwrecks. Now, zebra mussels tend to only live down to about 100 feet in Lake Champlain. Beyond that, the water's too cold, and they can't reproduce in those deeper water portions of the lake. So at this point, all the shallow water wrecks in the lake are covered with zebra mussels. To varying degrees depending on their location. But right now, the deep water shipwrecks like the Spitfire are beyond the preferred zone of zebra mussels. We have observed a number of zebra mussels on the remains of the Spitfire, even though it's at this much greater depth. but they don't seem to be reproducing, right? There are several dozen that are visible. They were probably transported to the site along with some aquatic weeds that washed out of shallow water bays during a storm event, and they kind of snagged on the shipwreck site. And then as the aquatic plants deteriorated, the mussels just relocated to the structure of the vessel. So that's a concern, but seems to be a manageable concern. Our really significant future concern is for a closely related mussel called the quagga mussel, which has very similar population dynamics to the zebra mussel. It also colonizes things in this very thick layers and causes all kinds of problems. And they can live to a much greater depth. In fact, they could gladly inhabit the entire depth of Lake Champlain, which is down to about 400 feet. So those mussels are already found in all the Great Lakes, in the St. Lawrence River, in the Hudson River. But remarkably, they have yet to come to Lake Champlain, knock on wood. If they do start to show up, they will inhabit this site and obscure its details and cause it to deteriorate more quickly than if they don't show up. So that's our main vector of concern at the moment, is the quagga mussels.
Can you differentiate American from British gunboats based on royally marked cannons, ship design, etc.?
Well, unfortunately, we have yet to find a British gunboat. So during the course of the battle, there is report of one of the British gunboats being hit by a cannonball and their powder magazine exploding and sinking. And we've done some pretty extensive searching in the area where we believe that that wreck would have gone down, and unfortunately, we have not been able to identify it. But if we did come across one, I think it would be pretty easy to distinguish from the American class of gunboats based on its length. And if you notice from the lines drawing I had up briefly, they are actually boat shaped. They're not the flat bottom boat that the American vessels were really designed with, which is really kind of an expanded bateau. It's the pretty standard workhorse vessel of colonial North America was a flat bottomed vessel called a bateau, and the American gunboats are really just an expanded bateau design, where the British gunboats appear to be more like we would think of a regular rowing gig in shape. They were curved. So I think it would be pretty straightforward to distinguish that. On the subject of the guns or cannons, that's much more difficult, because obviously, as we just discussed with the exploded cannon, guns were switching hands and locations all the time. Guns were enormously valuable, so you always wanted to capture or recover a cannon when you could, so that you could use them yourselves. And the British actually came back into Arnold's Bay several days after the burning event, and they fished around in all the wrecks and recovered whatever cannon they could find, and then incorporated those into their fleet and into their armies. So I don't think cannon would necessarily be a distinguishing feature in identifying what's British and what's American, because they were often the same. And frankly, at this point, there weren't many cannon foundries in the colonies. Not that were producing significant sized guns anyway. So they were almost all shipped in from Europe.
There's a question from the beginning of the presentation about Valcour Island and whether it was part of New France or Lower Canada at the time. I'm guessing at the time of the battle.
Well, that's an interesting question. It certainly was part of New France during the French and Indian War, but by the time of the American Revolution, that had the French had been pushed out in the 1760s, late 1750s, and so that was all part of the New England colonies, right? There is the dispute over whether Vermont was New Hampshire or New York or something else, and Valcour, I think, was pretty consistently considered part of New York, considering how it's the fact that it was pretty adjacent to the shoreline there.
Question about the hydro cable, the Hydro-Quebec placing electric cable that was placed for transfer to New York City. Was anything found when they were placing the cable And did Hydro-Quebec, were they required to be sensitive to the lake bottom, which I'm assuming they were as part of the National Preservation Act?
Yes, yes. So what we're talking about here is a project called the Champlain Hudson Power Express. And this is a privately funded, what do they call it? A commercial transmission line, with the idea of bringing renewable energy from Hydro-Quebec down to New York City and helping to fulfill some of New York State's renewable energy quotas. The project is actually being developed by TDI, Transmission Developers International, which is a huge conglomerate, and they're the ones that are paying for this line to be brought down. It will be bringing energy from Hydro-Quebec, but they're not the ones that are actually paying for the line to be installed. And they are absolutely required to both consider environmental impacts and impacts to cultural resources like shipwrecks throughout the length of the project, both on land and in the lake. And so we have been contracted, the Maritime Museum has been contracted by the developers to help them avoid any sensitive cultural resources, both in Lake Champlain, and we've also been working with them in the Hudson River portion of the transmission line. So I don't know that anything really exciting that was previously unknown was discovered. During the design process, they were obligated to collect extremely detailed hydrographic survey data of the transmission line corridor, which has been great for us to be able to review and look at that data. And through that process, we were able to help steer the line around any potentially sensitive areas, to make sure that they weren't impacting any of those sites that we identified. And that's both one of their obligations under Section 106 of the National Preservation Act, but they're also very committed as a company to ensuring that they don't have significant environmental or cultural reason, historic property impacts. So it's been a really interesting project to work on, and as you probably know, construction is underway. They got a good portion of the line installed to Lake Champlain and in the Hudson River, and they should be finishing up in 2025. Yeah, probably this summer they should finish up. I'm really curious about how this whole thing is going to be affected by the current relationship with Canada and the tariffs and energy threats. It's quite a fascinating time to be involved. Well, to be alive, let's just say that.
Well, that's a good segue to the next question, which is, do you have any idea about federal funding?
Oh.
Is any of the federal funding needed to continue this work in jeopardy?
Yes. Yes to all of those. The current series of executive orders coming out of Washington, and the restructuring of many federal agencies is having very significant impacts on funding streams, and causing sleepless nights. So absolutely, a large portion of our funding for archaeological work has come through federal funding streams. We currently hold grants from NOAA, from the EPA, from the National Park Service, from the National Archives and Records Administration. It just goes on. And all of those are a little bit iffy right now. It seems that the grants that had been previously awarded, the money that we have for 2025, that's there. We're able to access that money and to continue that work. What's going to happen in 2026 and beyond, I really don't know. I am happy to report that we just turned in a pretty weighty grant application to the National Park Service to do that work on the Spitfire site in 2026. And the 250th commemorations seem to be one portion of our country's history that the current administration is fond of and is supporting. So I'm cautiously optimistic that that funding stream will continue to exist at least through 2026. But we're kind of at a wait and see what happens with the rest of it. And that's true, of course, not only for the Maritime Museum, but any nonprofit in the area, as I'm sure Aaron understands. It's very concerning. It's a very concerning situation.
That's a good segue to two questions about the Spitfire. Are there plans to raise her? And if not, how well can it be preserved? Can the mast be repaired on site? And what does an expanded excavation entail?
Yeah, it's a challenging site to work on. Our current planning does not include the recovery of the Spitfire and ultimately conservation and display. That doesn't preclude the work that we're going to do, that we're proposing to do in 2026 and beyond. Doesn't preclude that from happening in the future if funding and support for that should arise and the desire to do it. But we're really focused on learning what we can from the site through excavation and documentation. And our real concern here is the potential arrival of the quagga mussel, right? We want to gather as much of this information as possible before we assume these are going to arrive at some point in the future. So that's really our goal for the moment. Again, that's the ultimate recovery of the vessel is certainly a possibility, but it's not part of our current thinking. As far as the preservation of the vessel, I think that if we do start to see quagga mussels entering the Champlain Valley, we would probably suggest that we bury the site. We might, build basically a snow fence around it and pump mud into it until it's buried, because the quagga mussels don't penetrate into the sediment. They don't colonize on the sediment. And if the site was buried, it would be extremely well preserved. The mud at the bottom of Lake Champlain is an exceptional preservation environment. It's basically an anaerobic, oxygen-free environment. So encapsulating the wreck in that way, while it would be a real bummer to cover up such an amazing artifact, that's the way that we could preserve it into the future until there's a solution to the quagga mussel problem, or the financial and willpower to raise and conserve the vessel entirely.
The question is about the water depth of the lake. You had mentioned that Lake Champlain, where the Spitfire is deep enough that I think you said the zebra mussels don't go. I guess the question is, what is the depth of the lake at the Spitfire, and what is the depth of the at Arnold Bay where the Congress is?
Yeah, so I'll start with the second question there. The Arnold's Bay, it's remarkably shallow. The Congress remains are in literally 10 feet of water. And so that makes them extremely easy to excavate and to work on. You can spend several hours down there at a time doing that work. And so that's that. Plus, it's literally like right in our backyard. It's just a couple miles down the lake. So it's really a great project to work on, and it's a great experience to give to archaeological students. We work with a lot with graduate students and young professionals, and we can give them a safe and interesting site to work on when we're working in Arnold's Bay. The depth of the Spitfire is unfortunately classified information, because if I was to share the exact depth of the vessel, you could literally look at a nautical chart and find that number, and you would be at the site. So at this point, we're keeping the piece of information under wraps. But it's beyond recreational dive limits, if that means anything to anybody. It's deep. And it's the kind of site that when we do work on it, it's, those dives are going to be short. If we're able to achieve even 30 minutes of bottom time, you're going to have to spend probably 2 hours coming up to get to decompress and to off gas the nitrogen bubbles that you will acquire when you're down at that depth. It's going to be a lengthy and challenging process, but with current dive technology, I think it can be done safely and effectively.
That actually, I had a question when you were talking about the depth where the Congress is, and you touched on this with the Spitfire, which is, do you find people coming and looting the sites? Has that been an issue and concern? I know it's generally a concern with archaeological sites.
It certainly is a concern. The Spitfire site is, again, it's at this considerable depth, which makes it less accessible in that regard. There are people that dive to that depth regularly. And we do know that the site has been visited a number of times by divers. Luckily, they don't seem to have impacted the site or removed anything from it, which is great. And there are laws and regulations in place that if you do disturb the site, there are very significant punishments that can be brought down. So Spitfire so far has been relatively untouched. Arnold's Bay is a very active harbor in the summer. Lots of people swimming and boating there. But we knock on wood again, we haven't had anybody messing with the site at this point. There has been some metal detecting that's taken place in the farm fields and along the shoreline there, which is all private property and is marked as no trespassing. So, they've chased some people off their property who were metal detecting in those areas. But generally speaking, there has been very little unauthorized impact to these sites, and hopefully it stays that way.
Thank you, Chris, so very much for your time today and for this really wonderful, one of the comments was that you gave the best, clearest account of the battle that one of our attendees has seen, and I second that.
Thanks.
It very much appreciated and extremely informative. If you're not a member of Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, you can join and support their work and visit the museum. If you are a member of AARCH or the museum, thank you for your membership and for your support. If you're not, please consider joining. Thank you again. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.